When I was thinking about what to talk about today, I listened to this speech from Malcolm, and also I was able to attend a very interesting educational this past Wednesday at the People's Power Assembly meeting, the weekly meeting, where they were honoring Malcolm X. And as part of Black History Month, and reading certain passages, from a talk, or different talks that Malcolm gave, including some of this talk that you just heard, and then talking about how all of his speeches and what he said, his profound words, and how it impacts today with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think just by hearing those words, when he talks about the ballot or the bullet, I think it's a very appropriate, topic, for today's meeting. And I really wanted to share some of other Malcolm's, writings, and also what I feel is a big part of his legacy. Malcolm talked about, when he talked about the Ballad of the Bullet, because the Ballad of the Bullet speech was really an hour and a half long. This was only about 7 minutes. So a big part of his speech in Ballad of the Bullet was talking about the Democrats and Republicans, and if there was any difference between the Democrats and the Republicans back in that time. And the main point he was making, of course, was that there really wasn't any fundamental difference. There may have been strategic and tactical differences. And what he said about the Democrats was really, they were really the Dixiecrats. Because that speech was done in 1964 when Lyndon Baines Johnson had become the president. And of course, Johnson was a racist from Texas who had become president because of, the Kennedy assassination. So he made some really, interesting connections between the Dixiecrats, who were really the Southern racists who happened to be in the Democratic Party, and the Democrats in general, and also the Republicans. And of course, it'd be really good for us to talk about how that connects today. Is there really any fundamental differences between the Democrats and Republicans today, which came out of this last election? But probably the most lasting legacy, I feel, that Malcolm left us is really the need to develop political class consciousness. When Malcolm first became political, when he met the Nation of Islam in prison in the 1950s, and I think something that a lot of people don't realize is that the FBI's Cointelpro program, which was developed really in the late 40s, early 50s, especially with the Cold War and with the growing national liberation movements, not only in the United States but around the world. Malcolm X was in prison, but Malcolm X was one of the first targets of Cointelpro back in 1951-52. A lot of people think it was later on, but it was then, because the Nation of Islam was very, very prominent in the prisons at that point. The Nation of Islam was a way for a lot of, black people, black men in particular, who were, in prison, to really find some type of, freedom, freedom from the oppression of being in prison. And Malcolm found the Nation of Islam. He went from being a street hustler in Boston, where he grew up, or where he was when he was a young person trying to survive, to being a revolutionary black nationalist, where he mainly focused on the plight of, at that time, 22 million people, or African Americans, which really make up the black nation, being victimized by economic and political racist terror. And Malcolm would evolve into a proponent of stressing unity and solidarity, especially amongst black folks in the United States, with those on the African continent. Why it was crucial to put aside any political or religious differences to focus on a common enemy and common goals, as he pointed out in that talk. And to help realize this goal, in 1964, he helped found the Organization of Afro-American Unity, or the OAAU, in Harlem, after he left the Nation of Islam. And the OAAU was a secular institution that sought to unify 22 million African Americans with the people of the African diaspora, especially on the African continent. And it was modeled on the Organization of African Unity, which was a coalition of at least 53 African nations working to provide a political voice for the continent, along with economic independence from imperialism, and especially imperialist banks like the IMF and the World Bank. And Malcolm sought to reconnect African Americans with their African heritage, establish economic independence, and to promote African American self-determination. This is something that our party has always defended since our founding in 1969 for all oppressed nations. And the OAU was designed to encompass all peoples of African origin in the Western Hemisphere and on the continent. And Malcolm X insisted that the progress for African Americans was intimately tied to the progress in Africa. And he outlined 5 fronts for this progress called the Basic Unity Program. And this called for restoration, for reorientation, education, economic security, and self-defense as a means of promoting Pan-Africanism, unity, and interest. And really, before he was assassinated, he was working towards, through the OAAU, to bring grievances from black people, especially in the United States, but worldwide, to the United Nations. But of course, his assassination really derailed that plan. But really, in terms of Malcolm's evolution, in terms of his class consciousness, in developing a world perspective, it really happened after his trip in 1965 to Mecca, Saudi Arabia, which was really known as the birthplace of Islam by millions of people, where there he met Muslims from all over the world, different, nationalities, different, skin tones and so forth, but especially, and including Muslims from Africa. And this experience further cemented his worldwide perspective as an internationalist, meaning that he went from seeing, quote unquote, the white man as being the enemy, which really was popular at that time, to a global system that's rooted in colonialism and neo-colonialism. I just want to read a quote from one of his final speeches. This was in January 1965, and he said, quote, "When black Americans see that our problem is the same as the problem of the people who are oppressed in South Vietnam and the Congo and Latin America, that the oppressed peoples of this world, Earth, make up a majority, not a minority, then we approach our problem as a majority that can demand, not as a minority that has to beg. It is incorrect to classify the revolt of black people as simply a racial conflict of black against white, or as purely an American problem. Rather, we are today seeing a global rebellion of the oppressed against the oppressor, the exploited against the exploiter." End quote. Malcolm's legacy really reminds me of the quote from another great freedom fighter who was also martyred by the U.S. government terrorist Cointelpro, and that was Fred Hampton from the Black Panther Party, who stated, "You can kill a revolutionary, but you can't kill the revolution." And at this point, I just want to read just a few passages from Malcolm. I just feel I can't express better than him in terms of this evolution. And I'm really hoping that the conversation that we plan to have today will encourage those who are less familiar with Malcolm's speeches. You should either go to Google and you can just Google Malcolm X speeches, like 50 come up right away, you can read them, or YouTube. You can check out a lot of his talks on YouTube, and how his legacy really resonates today in terms of us continuing to develop a world perspective, especially in the light of Trump. What's going on, the fact that the world is so much smaller now because of technology. We have an easier way of communicating with each other. To calling mass demonstrations and shutdowns, not only here but around the world. What Viju raised about the March 8th global women's strike, that's happening in 30 countries. That's not just happening here. It's happening in at least 30 countries. So we're not alone in terms of facing the same problems that women are facing, in various communities. It's not a localized struggle. It's really a global struggle. So I just wanted to just quickly read some of these. I'm not going to read the part about how America has a problem. I think he pointed that out in terms of why you catch hell. I think so. I'm not going to read that one. Let's see. In terms of what he said about what is a revolution, which he started in this, and again. Malcolm really was a student of world history when it came to applying a revolutionary perspective to black people in this country. And he stated here, it's very interesting, quote, "Look at the American Revolution in 1776. That revolution was for what? For land. Why do they want land? Independence. How was it carried out? Bloodshed. Number one, it was based on land, the basis of independence. And the only way they could get it was bloodshed." Of course, he didn't quite, raise the issue of, the native struggle, which, needs to be raised. But anyway, then he goes on to the French Revolution. What was it based on? The landless against the landlord. What was it for? Land. How did they get it? Bloodshed. Was no love lost, was no compromise, was no negotiation. I am telling you, you don't know what a revolution is. Because when you find out what it is, you'll get back in the alley. You'll get out of the way. The Russian Revolution, what was it based on? Land. The landless against the landlord. How do they bring it about? Bloodshed. You haven't got a revolution that doesn't involve bloodshed. How can you justify being nonviolent in Mississippi? This is when he was talking about the so-called Negro Revolution, the difference. He says, how can you justify being nonviolent in Mississippi and Alabama when your churches are being bombed and your little girls are being murdered? And at the same time, you're going to get violent with Hitler and Tojo and somebody else that you don't even know. If violence is wrong in America, violence is wrong abroad. If it is wrong to be violent defending black women and black children and black babies and black men, then it's wrong for America to draft us and make us violence abroad in defense of her. And if it is right for America to draft us and teach us how to be violent in defense of her, then it is right for you and me to do whatever is necessary to defend our own people right here in this country. Okay, and then he says, so I cite these various revolutions, brothers and sisters, to show you you don't have a peaceful revolution. The white man knows, and this was written in 1963, the white man knows what a revolution is. He knows that the black revolution is worldwide in scope and in nature. The black revolution is sweeping Asia, sweeping Africa, is rearing its head in Latin America. The Cuban Revolution, that's a revolution. They overturned the system. Revolution is in Asia. Revolution is in Africa. And the white man is screaming because he sees revolution in Latin America. Okay, I think I want to end with this, which I didn't know. I'm going to end with what he says. You should know who your friends are and who your enemies are. And he says, he's reading a letter. He's reading a letter at this event. It was he was speaking with Dick Gregory, the famous comedian. at the Audubon Ballroom, which is where he was assassinated. This was just 2 months before he was assassinated. And he and Dick Gregory did a meeting together. He says, I love a revolutionary, and one of the most revolutionary men in this country right now was going to come out here along with our friend, but he thought better of it. But he did send this message, and it says, Dear brothers and sisters of Harlem, I would have liked to have been with you and Brother Babu, but the actual conditions are not good for this meeting. Receive the warm salutations of the Cuban people, and especially those of Fidel, who remembers enthusiastically his visit to Harlem a few years ago. United, we will win. And this is from Che Guevara. I'm happy to hear your warm round of applause in return, because it lets the man know that he's not just in a position today to tell us who we should applaud for and who we shouldn't applaud for. And you don't see any anti-Castro Cubans around here. We eat them up. And I'm going to end with that.